Welcome to the Philosophical Odysseys podcast.
It is great to be here.
So I want you, the listener, to imagine something for a second. Imagine your best friend is, without a doubt, the greatest mind of your century.
Oh, setting the bar high.
Right. But here is the catch. Society genuinely despises them. I mean, absolutely hates them.
Oh, that is a tough position to be in.
Exactly. So how far would you go to defend that person?
That is the ultimate question, really.
Would you risk your own, carefully cultivated reputation, your entire career trajectory, just to ensure the world understood the true character of this person you loved?
It's a profound test of loyalty, for sure. And honestly, that specific tension sits at the very heart of the historical relationship we are exploring today.
It really does. So our mission for today's deep dive is unpacking Dennis C. Rasmussen's book, The Infidel and the Professor, David Hume, Adam Smith, and the friendship that shaped modern thought.
Such a fantastic read.
It is. And this isn't just like a standard dual biography.
No, not at all.
We are going on an exploration of how two seemingly contradictory personalities, one a notoriously open skeptic and the other a deeply guarded academic, how they forged a bond that literally laid the theoretical groundwork for modern economics.
And moral philosophy, too. Not to mention the entire concept of liberal commercial society.
Right. We're talking about the foundational blueprints of how we understand the modern world today.
All tracing back to two guys sharing a fire and a glass of claret in 18th century Scotland.
Which is wild to think about. But to really grasp the magnitude of what these two accomplished, we have to look closely at the soil from which they sprang. Right?
Absolutely. The 18th century Scottish Enlightenment.
Because if you rewind to the beginning of that century, Scotland was absolutely not a beacon of progressive thought.
Far from it. I mean, it was impoverished, it had been recently ravaged by famine, and it was completely dominated by the strict Presbyterian Kirk.
The church just ran everything.
They did. Just to give you a sense of the atmosphere, the Kirk was executing women for witchcraft as late as 1727.
Wait, 1727?
Yeah.
You usually think of witch burnings as, medieval phenomena, or at least confined to the 1600s.
Yeah, right, but this is right on the doorstep of the so-called Age of Reason.
That is just jarring.
The specifics are even worse, actually. They executed a woman named Janet Horne because they claimed, get this, that she turned her daughter into a pony and rode her to the devil's gathering.
Oh, wow. That's literal madness.
It is. And a few decades prior to that, in 1697, there was an 18-year-old university student named Thomas Aikenhead.
Okay, what happened to him?
He was hanged in Edinburgh simply for making boastful, blasphemous remarks to his friends.
Just for talking big with his buddies.
Exactly. The church dictated the entire rhythm of daily life. I mean, you couldn't dance, you couldn't be merry at weddings.
That's no fun allowed.
Literally. You couldn't even walk idly on the streets on a Sunday without facing public censure or hefty fines.
I think Voltaire visited Britain around this time,
Yeah,
right?
they did, yes.
And he characterized the typical Presbyterian minister as someone who puts on a sour look and just harangues his flock with severe exhortations against any form of joy.
That is a perfect summary of the vibe. A society completely locked down by religious dogma and extreme poverty.
But then something shifts dramatically, doesn't it?
It does. The catalyst was the Union of 1707.
Right, merging the Scottish and English parliaments to create Great Britain.
Exactly. Now, politically, Scotland gave up a lot. They only secured 45 of the 558 seats in the House of Commons.
So they were a massive minority.
Huge minority. However, they retained absolute control over their legal, religious, and educational establishment.
Oh, that's key.
It is. And crucially, this union opened up unfettered access to English markets and their vast colonial trade network.
So a vibrant new age of economic prosperity just begins almost overnight.
Pretty much. Removing trade barriers essentially injected a ton of capital into a society that already had a highly structured, localized education system.
Because the Kirk managed the schools.
Right. They had the literacy, they just needed the resources.
So that is the alchemy of the Scottish Enlightenment.
Exactly. Wealth created leisure, and leisure fueled intellectual inquiry.
Dugald Stewart, a contemporary biographer, described it as a sudden burst of genius that seemed to spring up by enchantment.
It really did feel like magic. Scotland transformed from this struggling outpost into an intellectual powerhouse rivaling Periclean Athens.
You suddenly have brilliant minds emerging everywhere.
Yeah, James Hutton, founding modern geology.
Yeah.
Joseph Black, isolating carbon dioxide.
James Watt revolutionizing the steam engine.
Exactly. And of course, a dazzling literary and philosophical scene.
Which brings us to the two men standing at the absolute center of this culture explosion.
Yes.
David Hume is born in 1711, and Adam Smith arrives 12 years later in 1723.
Right.
But, looking at their public personas, they're wild opposites.
Total opposites. Let's start with David Hume.
Okay.
He was a highly gregarious, outgoing figure. Physically, he was imposing.
Imposing how?
Well, he started out quite lean in his youth, but as he grew older and wealthier, he developed a very corpulent figure.
He got big.
He got very big. There is a famous portrait of him by Alan Ramsay where he is wearing a bright turban-like cap.
Which I think was actually the height of fashion at the time.
It was, yeah. But it framed this broad, heavy face. An observer in Turin once described him as looking more like a turtle-eating alderman than a refined philosopher.
Oh man, that is a brutal description from a contemporary.
It is. But Hume never let it bother him. He was relentlessly good-natured and frequently cracked jokes about his own girth.
He just rolled with it.
He did. He loved food, he loved playing whist, and he just thrived in social company.
But intellectually, he was uncompromising, wasn't he?
Completely. He was an open agnostic in a society that, as we just discussed, hanged people for blasphemy not long before.
Right.
He was universally known as the Great Infidel. And because of his views, the clergy continuously blocked him from university professorships.
They simply wouldn't allow someone with his skeptical views to instruct the youth.
Exactly. They shut him out of academia entirely.
Meanwhile, Adam Smith navigates that exact same academic system flawlessly.
He really does.
I mean, he secures the highly prestigious chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow University, mostly because his personality is the total inverse of Hume's.
Yeah, Smith was known as a profoundly absent man.
Like absent-minded professor.
Exactly. He was constantly lost in his own thoughts. He would frequently mumble to himself or just smile at some internal realization while walking down the street.
Or even sitting in a church service, apparently.
Yes. He was definitely not the life of the party. He was a lifelong bachelor who lived with his pious mother for most of his life.
We don't even have a painted portrait of him from his lifetime, do we?
No, we don't. Just a famous profile medallion done by James Tassie late in his life. It shows a man with a prominent nose and a somewhat withdrawn expression.
So he kept his head down, and he kept his religious views completely ambiguous.
Very guarded.
But this dynamic creates an obvious question. Okay, let's unpack this.
Here.
If Hume is this radically skeptical, notorious infidel, and Smith is a cautious, respectable professor embedded in the religious establishment, isn't associating with Hume a massive, unforced error for Smith?
It sounds like a PR nightmare, right?
A total PR nightmare. Like, why risk it?
Well, on the surface, the optics were terrible for Smith. But we have to look past the superficial differences to their core philosophical alignment.
Okay, where are they aligned?
Politically, they were both what intellectual historians call skeptical Whigs.
Skeptical Whigs.
Yeah, they supported the modern commercial order of Britain, the rule of law, and religious toleration, but they deeply distrusted grand, sudden political innovations.
I want to pause on that term, skeptical Whig, because if they are Enlightenment thinkers, shouldn't they be championing radical change?
You would think so.
Yeah, I mean, the Enlightenment is usually associated with overturning the old order.
It is, but the British context is vital here. Remember the trauma of the previous century.
The English Civil War.
Exactly. The execution of Charles I, the religious fanaticism of Cromwell's protectorate, and the ongoing Jacobite rebellions in Scotland.
It was a bloody mess.
A total mess. Hume and Smith grew up in the shadow of immense bloodshed, driven by people who believed they had the absolute divine blueprint for a perfect society.
Oh, I see.
So their skepticism applied as much to political utopianism as it did to religion.
They believe human reason is fallible.
Right, so you should never tear down a functional society to build a theoretical one. Gradual, measured reform was their shared ethos.
Okay, so they shared a profound political pragmatism. But what about the religious divide?
That is trickier.
Was Smith secretly just as skeptical as Hume, but just, better at playing the game?
Most modern scholarship suggests Smith was likely a deist.
A deist, okay.
He definitely did not align with Orthodox believing Christianity, but he might have retained a vague belief in a distant higher power or an organizing principle of the universe.
Watchmaker God.
Exactly. However, in the context of 18th century Scotland, deism and atheism were viewed as equally dangerous by the Kirk.
Wow.
Smith watched his older friend get attacked, insulted, and barred from academic posts. It is highly probable that Smith's reticence was a calculated survival strategy.
Why pick a public fight with the zealots if it ultimately strips you of your platform to teach and write?
Exactly. Why become a martyr?
He recognized that martyrdom doesn't get your books published.
That is a great way to put it.
So, to understand how these two disparate minds actually synthesized, we have to look at the scandalous piece of writing that first bridged the gap between them.
Yes.
David Hume's ambitious debut, A Treatise of Human Nature.
To set the scene for the treatise, we have to examine Hume's youth. In his late teens, he suffered a severe physical and mental breakdown.
What caused it?
His doctor diagnosed it as the disease of the learned. It was brought on by intense solitary reading and a desperate, almost obsessive search for a new philosophical truth.
He essentially burned himself out trying to deduce the nature of reality.
He really did. He hit an intellectual wall, realizing that abstract philosophy wasn't yielding the solid answers he wanted.
So how do you get out of it?
He recovered by forcing a change in his lifestyle. He socialized more, rode horses daily, and started eating well.
Which is actually how he gained his robust physique, right?
Exactly. Then he traveled to France, specifically settling in La Flèche.
Why there?
Because that is the very town where René Descartes was educated. Hume went there specifically to write a book that would dismantle Cartesian rationalism.
Oh, that is a bold flex.
It was. So he writes the treatise, returns to London in 1737, expecting to spark a massive intellectual revolution.
Oh, really?
He finally publishes it, and the reception is incredibly bleak.
He expects the world to tilt on its axis, and nobody even notices.
Nobody. Hume later famously lamented that the book fell dead-born from the press.
Ouch.
It didn't even excite a murmur among the religious zealots, which was the ultimate insult.
The zealots didn't even care enough to be mad.
Right. The public completely ignored a work that we now consider one of the greatest philosophical texts in the English language.
But the public ignoring it doesn't mean it vanished. Because far away, at Oxford University, a young Scottish student named Adam Smith gets his hands on a copy.
And Oxford at this time is highly reactionary.
Still heavily leaning toward Jacobite sympathies and Orthodox Anglicanism.
Exactly. It is not a place that encourages progressive thought.
So what happens with Smith?
Well, Smith was a student at Balliol College, and the Dons there, who were often referred to as Reverend Inquisitors, actually burst into Smith's room unannounced one day.
Just barged in.
And they caught him red-handed reading Hume's heretical treatise.
Uh-oh.
They confiscated the book and severely reprimanded him. Reading Hume was treated as an act of intellectual subversion.
It's treated like contraband.
Literally contraband.
So what does this all mean for the listener? I look at Hume's treatise like a completely radical, open-source operating system for the human mind.
I like that analogy.
Right. The general public saw the density of the code, decided it was too complicated, and ignored it. But Adam Smith secretly downloads it in his Oxford dorm, understands the architecture immediately, and uses it to start writing his own programs.
The analogy holds up well because Smith actively deployed Hume's methodology.
How so?
Well, Hume's overarching goal with the treatise was to build a science of man based purely on experience and observation.
Okay.
He vehemently rejected the idea that human beings are driven primarily by pure abstract reason. Hume concluded that reason is incredibly weak compared to our customs, our habits, and our passions.
Right.
His famous maxim is that reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions.
Meaning, we don't logic our way into our core beliefs. We feel our way into them and then use logic to justify those feelings after the fact.
Exactly that. We navigate the world because our imagination and our habits connect the dots of our experiences.
And Smith absorbs this.
Completely. And he applies it to a completely different field.
Yeah.
The history of science.
Really? Science?
Yeah. Before he ever touches economics or morality, Smith writes an essay on the history of astronomy.
Astronomy.
He uses Hume's psychological concept of the association of ideas to explain why scientific paradigms shift over time.
Using human psychology to explain the evolution of physics, how does he construct that argument?
What's fascinating here is how Smith frames it. He asks why humanity moved from Ptolemy's geocentric model to Copernicus's heliocentric model, and finally to Newton's laws of gravity.
Why did we?
He argues it wasn't just the accumulation of cold, hard data. Smith theorizes that human beings possess a deep psychological aversion to gaps in our understanding.
We hate the unknown.
Right. When the observed movement of the stars doesn't match our existing mental models, it causes cognitive dissonance, actual anxiety.
So we panic.
Yes. So we invent new, more elegant systems, like Newton's laws, to smooth out those gaps. It restores a feeling of tranquility and allows the association of ideas to flow naturally in our minds again.
So scientific progress is driven by our desire to avoid mental discomfort.
The crucial point here is that Smith is writing this at Oxford, entirely independently, yet his conclusions perfectly mirror a book Hume would write years later, The Natural History of Religion.
I see the parallel with astronomy, but how does Hume apply that to religion?
Hume argues in his History of Religion that early humans didn't invent gods out of philosophical deduction. They invented polytheism out of terror and ignorance of natural forces.
Oh, to make sense of the chaos.
Exactly. They created a god of lightning, a god of the sea, a god of the harvest to soothe their psychological anxiety about an unpredictable world.
Just like the astronomers mapping the stars to soothe their anxiety.
You've got it. Over time, as human understanding evolved, they sought more elegant, grander, unified theories, eventually arriving at monotheism.
Wow.
Smith was arguing the exact same psychological trajectory for science. Early humans were terrified by eclipses and comets, so they invented myths. Later, they invented complex scientific systems to calm that exact same psychological distress.
Both men concluded that human progress, whether in science or theology, is driven by our passions and our need for mental equilibrium.
Yes.
They are separated by hundreds of miles. One is facing the wrath of Oxford Dons. The other is brooding over unsold books in Scotland, and they are independently mapping the exact same uncharted territory of human nature.
It's incredible.
This shared psychological architecture makes their eventual meeting feel almost inevitable.
The intellectual groundwork was fully laid before they ever spoke a word to one another.
Let's move to that moment. It is 1749.
1749, yes.
Smith is back in Edinburgh, no longer a reprimanded student, but a rising academic star invited to deliver public lectures.
Right.
Sometime in the autumn, Hume returns to Edinburgh from his diplomatic travels on the continent, and the two finally cross paths.
They do.
And how do these towering intellects break the ice? With a highly pedantic debate about English history.
They were nerds, what can I say?
Total nerds.
Their first surviving correspondence is a debate over when English history actually begins, in a meaningful modern sense.
What was the debate?
Smith argued that it begins with Henry VII in 1485.
The start of the Tudor era.
Right, because that is when the power of the nobility was broken and a modernized absolute monarchy began to solidify.
Okay, makes sense. And Hume.
Hume, who is deep into writing his monumental history of England at this time, pushes back. He argues the real turning point is the Stuart era, starting with James I in 1603.
Why James I?
Because that is when the House of Commons finally began to assert itself. It sparked the battles between parliamentary privilege and royal prerogative that eventually forged the modern British Constitution.
It sounds like an obscure academic quibble, I know. But they are essentially arguing over the origin story of modern liberty.
Precisely.
And this shared obsession with how societies evolve flows directly into their next massive collaboration, which inadvertently lays the foundation for modern economics.
In 1752, Hume publishes a collection of essays titled Political Discourses. 8 of the 12 essays focus squarely on what we now call political economy. And Hume comes out swinging against the dominant economic theory of the era.
Mercantilism.
Mercantilism.
Right. So Hume is taking direct aim at a prevailing zero-sum mindset where national security meant hoarding bullion, gold and silver.
Right.
And actively choking off imports to keep wealth trapped inside your own borders.
Exactly. Mercantilism viewed global wealth as a fixed pie. If France gets a bigger slice, Britain inherently gets a smaller one.
Makes sense intuitively.
It does, but Hume completely dismantles this. He argues that the true source of a nation's wealth isn't the amount of gold or silver in its vaults.
What is it then?
It is the productive capacity and industriousness of its citizens. He robustly defends free trade, arguing that it is mathematically impossible to attain long-term prosperity by beggaring your neighbors.
Because if your neighbors are poor, they can't buy your stuff.
Exactly. If your neighboring countries are wealthy and prosperous, they become better customers for your own goods.
He also takes on a profound moral taboo of the era by defending luxury.
This was huge. To understand how radical this was, we have to look at the broader philosophical context.
To set the stage for us.
At the time, the two most venerable traditions of Western thought civic republicanism and Christianity both viewed wealth, commerce, and luxury as inherently corrupting.
Okay, why did civic republicanism hate it?
Civic republicanism, drawing on Sparta and early Rome, believed luxury made citizens soft, selfish, and unwilling to fight for the state.
And Christianity.
Christianity viewed luxury as a distraction from spiritual salvation and a manifestation of the deadly sin of greed.
So poverty was seen as a character-building virtue. You're supposed to be a stoic warrior or a pious ascetic.
Right, and Hume flips the script entirely.
How so?
In his essay of luxury, he argues that ages of refinement are actually both the happiest and the most virtuous.
Wait, virtuous?
Yes.
Yeah.
He argues that commerce promotes industriousness, it necessitates the spread of knowledge, and crucially, it fosters humanity and sociability.
Because you have to interact with people to trade with them.
Exactly. People who trade with one another are less likely to slaughter one another. Furthermore, he argues that commerce creates a middling rank of men, a middle class.
And why is that important?
Because they become the firmest basis of political liberty. They have a vested interest in the rule of law rather than the whims of a monarch.
Wow. And Adam Smith, who is now teaching at Glasgow University, reads this and begins actively integrating Hume's economic arguments into his own jurisprudence lectures.
He does.
And he specifically praises a concept of Hume's that economists now refer to as the specie flow mechanism.
Yes, Smith was deeply impressed by it. He told his students that Hume's reasoning on international trade was exceedingly ingenious.
Okay, so let's break down this specie flow mechanism without all the jargon.
Please do.
I like to visualize it as a system of water tanks connected by pipes, right? Where the water represents gold or money.
Okay, I'm with you.
If one country, adhering to mercantilism, tries to hoard all the gold by pumping it into their tank and closing the valves, what happens?
The water level rises.
The water level in that tank rises dramatically. In economic terms, inflation occurs. Prices skyrocket.
Right.
Because your prices are now sky high, your goods become way too expensive for anyone in the other tanks to buy.
Because they don't have enough water or gold to pay for it.
Exactly. Meanwhile, your citizens will look at the cheaper goods in the tanks with lower water levels and want to buy from them. So the gold naturally flows back out through the pipes to the cheaper countries.
It equalizes.
You can't cheat gravity in plumbing, and you can't cheat the market in economics.
That is an excellent visualization. Hume proved that the mercantilist obsession with stopping the export of gold was fundamentally self-defeating.
The market will always seek equilibrium.
Yes, and Smith took that Humean logic, expanded it, and began announcing to his students that Britain should immediately become a free port, allowing unfettered commerce and exchange with all nations.
You can clearly see the DNA of the Wealth of Nations being formed right here, decades before it's published, just through this exchange of ideas.
Oh, absolutely.
And Smith was so enamored with Hume's intellect that he actively tried to get him hired at Glasgow University.
He did. In 1751, the chair of logic at Glasgow became vacant. Smith wrote to a colleague emphatically stating he would prefer David Hume to any man for the position.
He wanted his intellectual sparring partner right down the hall.
Wouldn't you?
But the ghost of Hume's reputation haunts him again.
The violent and solemn remonstrances of the clergy arose once more. They completely blocked Hume's candidacy.
They were terrified of the great infidel having a platform to influence young minds.
They were, and so Glasgow University missed out on hiring the greatest philosopher of the age, and instead they settled for a man named James Clow.
James Clow, an academic footnote.
Literally, a perfectly respectable, perfectly forgettable professor who, to the best of our knowledge, never published a single scholarly work during his entire tenure.
It's a tragic loss for the university.
Yeah.
But Hume thrives regardless, right?
Yeah.
He has his independent income, his vibrant social life, and his deep correspondence with Smith.
Right.
And now the two friends turn their attention from history and economics to the very core of human behavior.
Yes. In 1759, Smith finally steps out of the shadows and publishes his first major book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Okay.
And this work is essentially a direct book-length response to David Hume's moral philosophy.
I absolutely love how Hume reacts when this book hits the presses.
It's so funny.
Smith is out in the Scottish countryside, completely isolated, sweating bullets over how his debut book is being received in the cutthroat intellectual circles of London.
Just agonizing over it.
Right. And Hume writes him a letter, but instead of just giving him the review, he spends paragraphs torturing him with irrelevant gossip.
He really does.
Talks about a random professorship opening. He critiques a mediocre epic poem. He complains about some other book.
He deliberately strings him along. He writes, "I know that you are more zealous of truth than of fame," playing on Smith's academic vanity, and then proceeds to distract him with every minor detail of London society.
That's just brutal.
And then finally, at the very end of a long letter, Hume casually drops the news. "But what is all this to my book, say you? I proceed to tell you the melancholy news that your book has been very unfortunate, for the public seem disposed to applaud it extremely."
I have terrible news. You're a massive success.
Yep.
It shows an incredible warmth and playfulness between them. But as they engage on the actual philosophy of the book, we see that while they agree on the foundation, they clash intensely over the blueprints.
They do. The foundational agreement between Hume and Smith is that morality comes from sentiments, meaning human feelings and emotions.
Not from abstract reason.
Exactly. They both believe that right and wrong aren't mathematical truths waiting to be logically deduced. They are emotional responses generated by our shared human nature.
And they both reject the prevailing orthodox idea that morality requires religious oversight, right?
Yes. You don't need a fear of hellfire to know murder is wrong. You know it's wrong because it feels deeply repulsive.
But they diverge sharply on the mechanics of these moral feelings. The three big battlegrounds between them are sympathy, utility, and justice.
Let's start with sympathy.
Okay. Both men use the word extensively, but they conceptualize it very differently.
For Hume, sympathy is essentially an emotional contagion.
Contagion.
Like a virus.
Kind of. He argues that human bodies are like tightly wound strings. When one vibrates, the adjacent strings naturally vibrate in resonance.
Oh, I see.
If you walk into a room where everyone is grieving, you literally catch their sadness, much like catching a yawn. It transfers to you automatically, bypassing your rational mind.
But Smith rejects that automatic transfer.
He does. Smith views sympathy as projection, what modern psychology would call empathy.
So it's more active.
Exactly. Smith argues we don't just passively absorb an emotion, we actively use our imagination to place ourselves in the other person's exact situation.
Like putting ourselves in their shoes. Yes. We ask ourselves, what would I feel if I were in their specific circumstances, facing their specific pressures? That imaginative projection is the core engine of Smith's moral theory.
Okay, that brings us to the second divergence, utility.
Right.
For Hume, utility, meaning usefulness to society, is the absolute foundation of why we approve of certain behaviors.
Hume believes we approve of traits like generosity, industry, or courage because those traits are fundamentally useful for maintaining a stable society.
Okay.
We sympathize with the public interest, and we see that these virtues make society run smoother, so we feel moral approval toward the person exhibiting them.
Why does Smith find that unsatisfactory? I mean, it seems perfectly logical that we like things that are useful.
Smith thinks this view is far too calculating and cold.
Cold how?
He argues that when we witness a heroic or generous act, we don't whip out a mental ledger to calculate its long-term societal benefits.
Right, we just react.
Our approval is immediate and instinctive. We approve of the action because it is proper and fitting for the situation at hand. We sympathize with the motives of the person acting, not just the eventual outcome of the action.
Okay, which brings us to the most intense divergence between the two friends.
Yes.
Justice.
Yes.
Hume views justice as an artificial virtue. He argues that the rules of property, contracts, and justice are human conventions. We invented them because we eventually realized they are useful for keeping society from collapsing into chaos.
But Smith vehemently disagrees with the idea that justice is merely an artificial construct born of utility.
What is his view?
Smith argues that justice is a natural virtue, and it stems from a very visceral and, frankly, dark human emotion. Resentment.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does.
Let me push back on this.
Yeah.
Because if Smith thinks justice is basically just, legitimized resentment, I mean, isn't that a terrifying view of the law?
That sounds pretty dark.
It makes the entire justice system sound like outsourced revenge.
It does carry that implication initially. But Smith argues that when we see an innocent person get robbed or assaulted, we don't feel anger because the abstract utility of society has been slightly diminished.
No, we feel angry for the person.
Exactly. We feel intense, imaginative sympathy with the victim, and we feel a natural resentment on their behalf toward the attacker. We want the perpetrator punished because the victim demands it.
But wait, if I get cut off in traffic, I feel resentment. If someone steals my carriage, I feel resentment. How does Smith differentiate between petty vengeance and actual societal justice?
That is the big question.
It's all rooted in my personal anger. Isn't that a recipe for a lawless purge?
The impartial spectator.
Yes. Smith clarifies that our personal resentment is only morally justified and only rises to the level of true justice if an objective, emotionally detached observer would also feel it.
So we have to judge ourselves. We have to mentally step outside ourselves and look at our own anger through the eyes of a neutral third party. If this impartial spectator looks at the crime and says, yes, your resentment is proportionate and that penalty fits the crime, then it is justice.
And if they don't?
If the spectator says, you are overreacting to a minor slight, then it's just petty vengeance.
But my spectator is still my creation, right?
Well, yes.
It's constructed by my cultural background, my biases, my era. How is a psychological courtroom inside my own head ever truly objective? Isn't Smith just giving us a philosophical loophole to justify our culturally conditioned biases?
That is the most enduring critique of Smith's moral theory.
It seems like a glaring flaw.
Smith acknowledges that the impartial spectator is shaped by society, but he argues it is the best tool we have. By constantly forcing ourselves to adopt the perspective of a neutral outsider, we gradually refine our moral compass.
It's a practice.
Right. It may not achieve perfect universal objectivity, but it prevents the kind of solipsistic revenge you're talking about. It keeps justice anchored in natural human feelings, but restrains it with the demand for broad social agreement.
It's an incredibly rich theory, and the theory of moral sentiments catapults Smith to international fame.
Huge fame.
The success of the book literally changes his life trajectory. He resigns his professorship to become a highly paid traveling tutor to a young duke, a role that eventually takes him to France.
And France is where the Enlightenment is currently burning brightest.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Hume is already in Paris, working as a diplomat, and Hume in Paris is treated like royalty.
The French absolutely adored him, didn't they?
They swarmed him. Princes, ambassadors, and the intellectual elite all vied for an invitation to his salons. He was known universally as Le Bon David.
Good David.
Exactly. When Smith arrives a bit later, he is welcomed into these exact same elite circles, mingling with legendary philosophers like Diderot and the economists like Turgot and Quesnay.
And they were developing early theories of free markets that would heavily influence Smith.
They were.
But with high society comes incredibly high drama.
Oh, definitely.
Tell me about Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Well, Hume, being famously kind-hearted and generous, decides to take in the exiled Swiss philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Okay.
Rousseau was undeniably brilliant, but he was also notoriously paranoid, difficult, and alienating. He was fleeing arrest on the continent for his controversial writings.
So Hume steps up to help.
He does. He arranges for Rousseau to find refuge in England, manages to secure him a generous pension from King George III, and sets him up in a comfortable country house.
He goes out of his way to save Rousseau's life and livelihood.
He does. But Rousseau's paranoia quickly takes over. He becomes convinced that Hume, his savior, is actually the mastermind of a massive international conspiracy to ruin his reputation.
That is insane.
Rousseau writes these unhinged, vitriolic letters accusing Hume of plotting against him with his enemies in Paris.
How does Hume, the philosopher of human nature, process this level of delusion?
Hume is deeply hurt, embarrassed, and completely bewildered.
Understandably.
He is a man who prides himself on his affable character and the strength of his friendships. Being publicly accused of treachery by someone he went to great lengths to help is devastating.
So what does he do?
Hume writes to all his friends across Europe, including Smith, asking for advice on how to handle the situation. Hume wants to publish a comprehensive public defense, a pamphlet laying out all their private letters to objectively prove his innocence to the world.
And Smith writes back and tells him to absolutely not do that.
Right. Smith writes a very strong, almost commanding letter advising Hume to maintain a dignified silence.
Just ignore him.
Exactly. Smith warns him that Rousseau is essentially a wild philosopher and a hypocrite who thrives on conflict. He tells Hume that publishing a defense will only feed the scandal.
Don't feed the trolls, basically.
Exactly. It will legitimize Rousseau's delusions and entertain the idle public at their expense. Smith's advice is clear. Let Rousseau rave. Anyone whose opinion actually matters knows your character, David, and knows these accusations are nonsense.
It perfectly highlights their differing psychological approaches to public conflict.
It really does.
Hume feels this naive, almost desperate need to clear his name logically. He thinks if he just shows people the empirical evidence, reason will prevail.
Yes.
But Smith, the keen observer of social dynamics, understands that scandal is a fire that requires the oxygen of engagement to survive. If you don't feed it, it starves.
It is a profound insight into their characters. Hume, the open book, cannot stand the thought of a stain on his honor remaining unanswered in the public square.
While Smith is much more guarded.
Smith, the guarded, calculating academic, understands the strategic power of silence.
So does Hume listen.
No. In the end, Hume's anxiety wins out. He ignores Smith's advice and publishes the defense anyway.
Of course he does.
It causes a massive sensation across Europe for a few months, but ultimately, history remembered Hume's kindness and Rousseau's descending madness.
What I find fascinating is the broader network of minds watching all this unfold. Like, Benjamin Franklin was part of this transatlantic circle.
Franklin is a wonderful connective thread in this era. He had traveled through Scotland, spent weeks staying with Hume, and met Smith.
Wow, just hanging out?
Yeah, they all shared this overarching Enlightenment vision of progress, liberty, and scientific inquiry. When Franklin returned to America, Hume wrote to him lamenting the loss of the first great man of letters America had produced.
That is high praise.
It is. Franklin interacted with both Hume and Smith in Scotland and in France, serving as a bridge between the Scottish Enlightenment and the American founding.
Amazing. Now, as that Parisian drama fades into the background, Smith eventually returns to Scotland and spends the next decade quietly forging his magnum opus.
The big one.
He draws heavily on Hume's historical insights, but he also dares to critique and correct his best friend's blind spots. The year 1776 arrives, bringing with it the wealth of nations.
1776 is obviously an auspicious year in general. But in the realm of economic thought, the publication of The Wealth of Nations is unparalleled.
Completely.
And the intellectual DNA of David Hume is woven deeply into its pages. The most striking example is a massive historical argument Smith lifts directly from Hume's previous work.
The Secret Revolution.
Yes. Smith asks a fundamental historical question. How did Europe transition from the brutal, oppressive, stagnant era of feudalism into the dynamic, modern commercial age?
How did we get out of the Dark Ages?
Right. And he answers it using the exact narrative Hume laid out in his History of England. Both men argued that the powerful feudal lords weren't defeated by kings, and they weren't defeated by standing armies.
Who defeated them?
They were inadvertently destroyed by commerce, specifically by the introduction of luxury goods.
Walk me through the mechanics of that. I mean, how does buying fancy things destroy a warlord's power?
Under the feudal system, a lord controlled vast tracts of land, but there's a very little to actually buy with the surplus agricultural wealth that land produced.
Okay.
So the only way a lord could utilize his wealth was to maintain a huge retinue of armed retainers, dependents, and tenants who were loyal exclusively to him. This gave the lord immense localized military power, allowing him to challenge the king and terrorize the peasantry.
He pays them in food and shelter, and they provide a private army.
Exactly.
Yep.
But then the expansion of foreign trade introduces luxury goods to Europe.
Diamond buckles, fine wines.
Intricate tapestries, silk clothes, yes. Suddenly, the lords have something else to spend their wealth on. They begin dismissing their vast retinues to afford these new trinkets.
They trade their armies for fashion.
They do. They dissipate their immense fortunes on personal consumption. Without their private armies of retainers, they lose their ability to threaten the central government or oppress the countryside. They trade their hard military power for soft luxury.
A revolution fought and won with diamond buckles and silk instead of swords.
As Smith famously put it, it was a revolution of the greatest importance to public happiness, brought about by two different orders of people, the lords who just wanted shiny things, and the merchants who just wanted to make a profit.
And neither of them had the least intention to serve the public.
Exactly.
It's the invisible hand at work, centuries before he even coins the term.
Yes, it is.
But Smith didn't just act as an echo chamber for Hume. He diverges from Hume in a massive way regarding the ultimate goodness of this new commercial society.
This is where Smith's nuance really shines. Hume was almost unbridled in his optimism about commerce.
He thought it fixed everything.
He thought it improved humanity on virtually all fronts, making us wealthier, freer, more knowledgeable, and more civilized. Smith entirely agreed with the macroeconomic benefits, but he was far more attuned to the psychological costs.
He recognized the profound human damage caused by capitalism.
I did.
Specifically, the dark side of the division of labor.
Right. Smith famously begins The Wealth of Nations by praising the division of labor. He uses the example of a pin factory to show how breaking down tasks leads to an astronomical increase in productivity and national wealth.
Odd.
But Hundreds of pages later in the book, he acknowledges the horrific psychological toll that exact same system takes on the individual worker.
He points out that a factory worker who spends his entire life performing one simple repetitive operation like pulling a lever or sharpening a pen all day loses the habit of mental exertion.
Smith writes that such a worker becomes as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become.
Wow.
He explicitly states that the dexterity of the worker in his specific trade is acquired at the expense of his intellectual, social, and martial virtues.
He calls it a mental mutilation. That is a staggering critique of the very system he is credited with inventing.
It really is.
It makes Smith a far more complex, sympathetic thinker than the modern caricature of a ruthless, laissez-faire capitalist who only cares about corporate profits.
He saw that the very engine of economic growth could hollow out the minds of the working class. And his proposed solution was equally surprising to modern readers.
What was it?
He argued that the government must actively intervene to prevent this by funding and mandating public education for the working poor.
Public education. How did Hume react to this? I mean, did he resent Smith for taking his historical arguments and then publicly correcting his blind spots about the dangers of commerce?
Not in the slightest.
Really?
Hume's reaction to receiving a copy of The Wealth of Nations was pure, unadulterated joy. He wrote to Smith expressing his huge relief and happiness that the book was a triumph.
That's lovely.
His only critiques were incredibly minor, friendly economic quibbles, like a disagreement over whether the rent of farms ultimately affects the price of commodities. There was zero ego, zero resentment, just deep pride in his friend's masterpiece.
Which makes the events of that exact same year, 1776, all the more poignant.
Uh.
In the same year, The Wealth of Nations changes the world. Their friendship faces its ultimate test.
Yeah, this is the hard part.
David Hume is diagnosed with bowel cancer. It is terminal, and he is declining rapidly.
Right.
But he faces his impending death with an absolute, unwavering cheerfulness that astounded everyone who visited him. He continues cracking jokes, reading history books, and playing cards with his friends.
He just didn't let it break his spirit.
And he is entirely unbothered by his lack of belief in an afterlife.
And the deeply religious public of Britain is watching his deathbed like hawks.
They are waiting for the great infidel to finally break down and seek salvation.
They absolutely were. James Boswell, the famous biographer and a deeply anxious, devout Christian, actually wrangles an interview with the dying Hume.
Oh, man.
Boswell goes in fully expecting or desperately hoping to see Hume terrified of damnation or perhaps finally recanting his lifelong skepticism and crying out for a priest.
And what scene actually greets Boswell?
He finds Hume sitting comfortably, making jokes about Greek mythology. Hume casually tells the terrified Boswell that he has no more belief in a future existence than he does that a piece of coal put upon the fire won't burn. Boswell leaves the house profoundly shaken. He simply cannot comprehend how a man can face absolute oblivion with such serene equanimity. It shatters Boswell's assumption that atheists must die in terror.
But amid this incredible serenity, a serious friction emerges between Hume and Smith.
It does.
It centers around Hume's final explosive manuscript, The Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion.
The Dialogues is Hume's most direct, devastating, and elegantly argued critique of religious belief, specifically targeting the argument from design.
Oh.
He knew it was far too dangerous to publish during his lifetime, but he desperately wanted it published after his death to cement his philosophical legacy.
So what does he ask Smith to do?
He formally asks Smith to be his literary executor and to ensure the dialogues see the light of day.
And Smith refuses.
He flatly refuses. He tells Hume he will not take responsibility for publishing it.
Why? If he's his best friend, and he likely agrees with the premise of the book, why abandon him on his deathbed request?
It was entirely about self-preservation. Smith had just published The Wealth of Nations. He had finally secured a peaceful, highly respected career, and he was hoping for a lucrative government appointment as a customs commissioner.
Oh, I see.
He knew that attaching his name as executor to Hume's ultimate atheistic manifesto would bring the full, unmitigated wrath of the Kirk and the British establishment down on him. It would ruin his life's work.
Hume must have felt betrayed.
He was definitely annoyed. He writes to Smith and essentially says, "I understand you are afraid, but it deeply disappoints me."
That's heartbreaking.
But the true testament to their friendship is that Hume forgives him. He makes alternative arrangements, instructing his nephew to publish the manuscript instead, and their friendship remains warm and intact until Hume passes away in August of 1776.
But Smith doesn't just walk away with a clean conscience. He refused to publish the dialogues, but he finds a different, arguably much more dangerous way to honor his friend's legacy.
Yes, he does. Hume had written a tiny, cheerful, and remarkably humble autobiography during his final illness called My Own Life.
Okay.
His publisher, William Strahan, planned to release it as a pamphlet. Smith decides to add a supplement to it, a public account of Hume's final days, which become known to history as the Letter to Strahan.
What does Smith write that is so provocative?
Well, he details Hume's absolute calmness in the face of death. He flaunts Hume's good humor, mentioning the jokes he told and the games he played. But the true bombshell is the final sentence of the letter.
What does he say?
Smith publicly declares that this notorious infidel, this man hated by the church, approached as nearly to the idea of a perfectly wise and virtuous man as perhaps the nature of human frailty will permit.
He calls a known, unrepentant non-believer the most perfect man he's ever met.
In the 18th century, that is throwing a lit match into a powder keg.
The outrage was massive, wasn't it?
Instantaneous and massive. George Horne, the president of Magdalen College at Oxford, leads a vicious public attack.
What did Horne say?
He writes a sarcastic, furious pamphlet accusing Smith of embalming a soulless body, essentially arguing that it is fundamentally impossible for a man to be virtuous if he is an atheist.
Right.
We have to view this impartially here. To the religious establishment, atheism wasn't just a difference of opinion, it was an active threat to the moral fabric of the universe. To defend an agnostic's virtue over that of a pious Christian's was an act of incredible, reckless bravery on Smith's part.
Which raises the ultimate question of this deep dive. Why did Smith do it?
It's a big question.
He avoided religious controversy his entire life. He literally just refused to publish Hume's dialogues to avoid this exact kind of heat. Why risk his career now for a man who is already dead and gone?
Because this was Adam Smith actively practicing his own moral philosophy.
Wow.
If you go back to the theory of moral sentiments, Smith writes extensively about the nature of true friendship. To both Smith and Hume, friendship wasn't just a social convenience. It was the highest of all human virtues.
It was everything.
It was the absolute core of a happy, meaningful life. Smith simply could not sit by and let his best friend's character be slandered by zealots after his death. He sacrificed his own peaceful, carefully guarded reputation to secure Hume's legacy as a good, moral man.
It completely shifts how we view Smith. He's usually painted as this cold, calculating grandfather of capitalism, but here he is, effectively ruining his own PR to save a friend's legacy.
Exactly. The letter to Strahan uses the word friend 17 times in just a few short pages.
Yeah.
It wasn't just an obituary. It was a manifesto on what philosophical friendship looks like in practice.
This story proves that philosophy isn't just something done by isolated hermits in dusty rooms. The ideas that shape the modern world, free trade, empathy, the mechanics of justice, the limits of reason, they were forged in letters between Edinburgh and Glasgow.
They were hammered out over shared dinners, robust disagreements, and profound mutual respect. Hume and Smith shaped modern thought precisely because they shaped each other. And here is a final provocative thought to mull over. Today, in our modern university systems, we separate economics, psychology, history, and moral philosophy into completely different departments.
Right, they're totally siloed.
They sit in different buildings, read different journals, and rarely speak to one another. But to David Hume and Adam Smith, it was all one giant science of man.
Because it's all connected.
Exactly. They didn't see boundaries between how we trade, how we feel, and how we govern. By hyper-specializing today, are we losing the very ability to see the big picture? Are we losing the capacity for the kind of cross-pollinating brilliance that allowed these two friends to change the world?
A brilliant question to leave on. Don't forget to follow us and subscribe to stay updated on our latest episodes and never miss a step in this Odyssey of thought. Until next time, keep questioning.